Johnny Jett from Barnwood Builders finally breaks his silence. He served in Vietnam, came home to West Virginia, spent the next 25 years doing utility work nobody ever films, lost a son he almost never speaks about in public, and then, well into his 60s, became a cast member on a national television show without changing a single thing about who he was. Johnny Jett is one of the longest-running faces on Barnwood Builders. But if you've watched the show for years and feel like you still don't really know him, that's not an accident. In this story, we're going to go through exactly who Johnny Jett is, where he came from, what happened to him that the cameras never fully captured, and why the quietest man on that crew might have the most to say of anyone on it. Before there was a show, there was a man who spent the better part of 3 decades working utility lines in West Virginia. Not a glamorous job, not a job that gets written about, but exactly the kind of work that keeps the infrastructure of rural America running. Johnny Jett did that work for roughly 25 years. He was skilled with his hands before Barnwood Builders existed, and he would have been skilled with his hands if the show had never been made. That matters because it tells you something about how he ended up on screen in the first place. Mark Bowe did not go looking for a personality. He went looking for someone who actually knew how to work with century-old timber, someone who had the instinct for what those structures were, and the patience to treat them correctly. Jett had both. But before the utility career, before the television, and before the restoration work that would eventually bring him a national audience, there was Vietnam. Jett served in the U.S. military during the Vietnam era, a detail he has acknowledged over the years but rarely elaborated on at length in public settings. He came back to West Virginia the way most veterans of that conflict came back. Quietly, without ceremony, into a country that was still in the middle of arguing about what the war had even been. He went back to work. He built a life. And like a lot of men who came through that period with scars they didn't particularly want to discuss on camera, he kept moving. What came after Vietnam, and what came before the television career, included a period Jett has been honest about in broad terms, a serious struggle with substance use. He has never hidden this part of his history, but he has not turned it into a storyline either. He addressed it, he moved through it, and he got to the other side of it the way a lot of people from that generation dealt with hard things. By getting up and going back to work. The man who eventually joined the Barnwood Builders crew was not someone who arrived at that job unmarked. He arrived at it having already survived more than most people watching the show would ever know. And if you think that backstory is where the weight of this story lives, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. Barnwood Builders premiered on DIY Network in 2013. The premise was direct. Mark Bowe and his crew travel rural Appalachia, find barns and log structures that are weeks or months away from collapsing, and salvage everything worth saving. The timber goes into new homes and structures. The history gets preserved. The show, deliberately, does not manufacture drama. That last part was non-negotiable for Bowe from the start. Multiple networks over the years expressed interest in the format only to push back on the show's refusal to stage conflict between cast members or engineer emotional moments for ratings. Bowe said no every time. The result is a show that runs against nearly every convention of reality television. No shouting, no rivalry, no personal confessions forced out by a producer with a camera in your face. For Johnny Jett, this made it the only kind of show he would have agreed to be on. He was already in his 60s when Barnwood Builders started filming. His entire working life had been spent doing things that mattered to him because of the work itself, not because of what the work signaled about him. Timber restoration fit that same framework. You either know how to read a 100-year-old structure and understand what it's telling you, or you don't. Jett knew, and the camera for the most part just followed him while he did what he had always done. What the audience saw was a craftsman who didn't perform. He was dry when the moment called for dry. He was patient when the job required patience. He was not there to be the character who carried the emotional arc of the episode. He was there to do the work. That authenticity, that refusal to be anything other than exactly what he was, is precisely what made him one of the most recognizable faces in the show's audience, even if he was rarely its loudest voice. But here's the part that changes everything about what you just heard. There are years in a person's life that change the shape of everything that came before and after them. For Johnny Jett, 2017 was that year. His son, Johnny Jett, died that year. Jett said almost nothing about it publicly. He did not step away from the show in a way that made headlines. He did not release a statement. He did not make the grief into content. He kept showing up. The cameras kept rolling, and the audience, for the most part, did not know exactly what he was carrying. This is the part of the Johnny Jett story that does not appear in the thumbnail roundups or the cast ranking articles or the fan forum posts about which crew member has the most impressive skill set. A man who had already survived Vietnam, survived addiction, built a career with his hands across 3 separate decades, and then found himself in his 60s with a national television audience. That man lost his son, and he processed that the way he had apparently processed everything that preceded it, quietly, privately, and by continuing to show up to work. There is a version of that story that sounds like suppression. There is another version that sounds like survival. What it actually is probably depends on how well you know the difference between those two things. What the audience should understand is that Jett's quietness on the show, the thing that some viewers read as reticence, or depth, or simply the personality of a man who doesn't fill silence for its own sake, exists alongside a private life that has included as much weight as any biography worth telling. He was not quiet because nothing had happened to him. He was quiet because he made a choice about what he was and was not willing to carry in public. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. At some point in the years before Barnwood Builders brought him to a national audience, and running parallel to it throughout the show's run, Johnny Jett has been making something other than restored structures. He paints. This is not a detail the show has built episodes around. It is not the angle that gets him features in home renovation magazines, but it is as real a part of who he is as any other element of this story. And it is the piece of the puzzle that makes him make complete sense as a person. The same hands that evaluate a century-old timber joint and decide whether it can bear weight have always had a second creative language running through them. Painting for Jett is not a hobby that appeared when he got famous enough to have leisure time. It is something he has returned to across different chapters of his life, including the hardest ones. Think about what that tells you. A man who came home from Vietnam and didn't talk about it. A man who worked through addiction without making it the centerpiece of his identity. A man who lost a son and kept showing up to work. That man has always had somewhere to put the parts of his experience that he wasn't going to hand over to anyone else's camera. The painting is that place. It also tells you something about the reduced screen time that longtime viewers noticed in the show's later seasons. The easy read on that is that Jett was stepping back from the show. The more accurate read is that Jett has always had a life that existed well outside the show's frame, and that as he's gotten older, more of his time and energy has shifted toward the parts of that life that were never about television in the first place. What happened next is the reason this story matters to anyone paying attention to what Barnwood Builders actually is. Barnwood Builders has been on the air for over a decade. It has outlasted the network it started on. DIY Network became Magnolia Network, and the show migrated without losing its identity. It has run through cast changes, production reinventions, and a television landscape that has completely reshuffled around it. And it has done all of that without ever becoming something it was not. The reason Johnny Jett is the right lens through which to understand that is simple. He is the most extreme version of the show's core proposition. The proposition is this, that the people doing the work are interesting not because of what they're willing to perform for the camera, but because of what they've actually lived. You don't have to perform a history like Jett's. It is already there in how he moves around a structure, how he evaluates a problem, how he stands in a space that is falling apart and decides what is still worth saving. That sensibility, the idea that a person who knows how to do something difficult with their hands is worth watching, no monologue required, is what the show built its audience on. And Jett embodies it more completely than almost anyone else in the cast. Sherman Thompson has his own version of this. Graham Ferguson has his. Mark Bowe built the entire operation on it. But Jett's version is the oldest, the quietest, and the one that has been most consistently underreported. He was already in his 60s when the show started. By the time most viewers found him, he had already lived 2 or 3 full careers worth of experience that the show never fully unpacked. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got, until now. Somewhere in the conversation around this show, quiet became a description that people applied to Johnny Jett as if it were simply a personality trait, the way you describe someone as tall or soft-spoken. But quiet, in Jett's case, is a methodology. It is how he has chosen to inhabit a life that has included things that could have defined him completely if he had let them. The Vietnam service could have become his entire identity. Veterans of that war who leaned into the narrative found that the public had strong feelings about them in whatever direction. Hero, victim, symbol. Jett did not lean into it. The addiction struggle could have become a recovery story that ran through every profile and interview. It did not. The loss of his son could have reshaped how he appeared on the show. More withdrawn, more visible in his absence, more obviously carrying something. If it did, most of the audience didn't notice, because he showed up and did the work. That is not a small thing. That is a specific and considered way of being in the world. One that says, the hardest things that have happened to me do not get to be the loudest things about me. The work gets to be the loudest thing. The craft gets to be the thing that people see. Everything else is mine. For an audience that spends a lot of its viewing time watching people hand their most private moments directly to the camera in exchange for engagement, that position is almost radical. It certainly explains why, after more than a decade on a national television show, Johnny Jett still feels like someone the audience doesn't entirely know. That was the point. That was always the point. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. Johnny Jett has not announced a departure from Barnwood Builders. He has not released a statement, done a farewell interview, or signaled in any way that he considers his chapter with the show to be over. What has shifted, visibly, is how much of his time appears to be going toward the work that has no audience. The painting. The things he makes in the spaces where no camera is pointed at him. For a man who has spent a significant portion of his late 60s and early 70s in front of a national viewing audience, returning more of his time to work that belongs entirely to him is not a retreat. It is a completion of something. He remains in West Virginia. That much is consistent across every report on where the Barnwood Builders crew has landed. The men who built this show, the ones who are still around, did not scatter to Nashville or Los Angeles or wherever former reality television personalities typically go when the attention moves. They went back to what they were doing before anyone showed up to film it. For Jett, that means timber. That means paint. That means a life that was already full before the cameras arrived and has remained full whether the cameras are running or not. Mark Bow's operation, Barnwood Living, continues out of White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. The show continues to air on Magnolia Network. The cast has shifted over the years. Tim Rose retired after 12 seasons. Alex Webb left to build his own business. Brian Buckner stepped away early and stayed private. But the core of what the show is has not moved. Jett is still part of that core in the most fundamental sense, not necessarily on screen in every episode of every season, but present in the identity of what the show always claimed to be. A group of men who knew how to do something difficult, who showed up and did it, and who didn't need you to understand the full weight of what they'd been through to respect the work they were doing right in front of you. The story of Johnny Jett is a story about what it looks like when a person decides that the hardest parts of their life belong to them, not to the audience watching them. He came back from Vietnam. He worked through addiction. He spent 25 years in a career that no one filmed. He built things with his hands. He lost a son. He kept painting, kept restoring, kept showing up. Not because the cameras were there, but because that's how he has always moved through the world. The show goes on. Barnwood Living continues to expand. Whatever Magnolia Network does with the next chapter of Barnwood Builders, Jett's relationship to it will be exactly what it has always been, defined on his terms, at his pace, and containing precisely as much as he chooses to share. The question worth putting to anyone who has followed this show is this: in an era when every personality on every platform seems to be telling you more and more about themselves, whether you asked or not, do you think Johnny Jett's decision to keep the hardest parts of his life private made you respect him more, or do you think the audience deserved to know the full story? Drop your answer below.